One of the first signs that someone carries the psychological pattern often associated with the Heyoka empath is this unusual ability to see through emotional masks almost immediately. And I want to be careful here because people often romanticize this idea. They imagine it as some mystical superpower. But in reality, it is usually the result of something much deeper and much more painful. Human beings become highly perceptive when they have spent years needing to read emotional environments for survival. A child who grows up in a psychologically unpredictable home learns very quickly that words cannot always be trusted. They begin paying attention to tone, facial tension, pauses, inconsistencies, emotional shifts. They learn to detect danger beneath politeness. They learn that sometimes the smile is not safety, sometimes silence is not peace. Sometimes affection comes attached to control. So the nervous system adapts. It becomes extraordinarily sensitive to contradiction. This is why many Heyoka-type individuals walk into a room and immediately sense what others miss. They notice the insecurity behind arrogance. They see fear beneath anger. They recognize manipulation hidden inside charm. Not because they are paranoid, but because they have spent much of their lives decoding emotional reality beneath surface performance. And this creates a very unusual social dynamic. People who are emotionally honest often feel strangely safe around a Heyoka. They may not even understand why. They simply feel seen without needing to perform. But people who rely heavily on masks, status, manipulation, or emotional control often feel deeply uncomfortable around them. Again, not because the Heyoka is attacking them, but because authentic perception itself can feel threatening to a false self. Carl Jung once said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And this is precisely what happens in many toxic dynamics. Most human beings are not interacting authentically. They are interacting through defense mechanisms, through personas, through carefully constructed identities designed to gain approval, avoid rejection, or maintain control. The Heyoka unconsciously disrupts this system because they respond less to the performance and more to the emotional truth underneath it. And here is where things become psychologically complex. Many Heyokas spend years doubting themselves because what they perceive is often denied by the people around them. They sense resentment behind kindness, dishonesty behind confidence, emotional hunger behind superiority. But because modern culture rewards image more than authenticity, the Heyoka frequently learns to suppress their own perception in order to fit in. This creates enormous internal conflict. They begin asking themselves, am I imagining this? Am I too sensitive? Am I overthinking? But sensitivity is not the problem. Unintegrated sensitivity becomes the problem. Perception without grounding can become anxiety. Awareness without boundaries can become emotional exhaustion. And this is why many Heyokas eventually reach a turning point where they stop trying to convince others of what they see. They begin trusting their nervous system instead of abandoning it. They realize that intuition is not magic. It is accumulated unconscious pattern recognition built through lived emotional experience. Now, this does not mean the Heyoka is always correct. No human being is projection exists. Trauma can distort perception. But when emotionally healthy, the Heyoka often possesses an extraordinary capacity for psychological accuracy because they are listening beneath language. They are observing what the body reveals, what energy conceals, what behavior repeats. And perhaps the deepest truth here is this: the Heyoka is not meant to expose others out of superiority. That is the ego's distortion. The real purpose of this sensitivity is understanding, compassion, clarity. Because once you truly see human beings beneath their masks, you also begin to understand how wounded most people really are. The controlling person is often terrified. The arrogant person is often deeply ashamed. The manipulative person is often emotionally starving. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it changes how you understand it. And when a Heyoka matures emotionally, they stop using perception as a weapon and begin using it as wisdom. Because the greatest power is not seeing through people. The greatest power is seeing clearly without losing your humanity. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the Heyoka empath is that their strength is rarely born from comfort. It is born from chaos. And this is important to understand because modern culture tends to confuse emotional strength with confidence, success, or external composure. But psychologically speaking, real resilience is usually formed in environments where a person had no choice but to adapt in order to survive emotionally. Many Heyokas grow up inside contradiction. Love may have been present but inconsistent. Safety may have existed, but only conditionally. They often experience relationships where affection and pain become psychologically intertwined. And when this happens repeatedly, the nervous system develops in a very particular way. The individual becomes highly aware of emotional instability, but also strangely capable of functioning inside it. This is why many Heyokas later discover that they can remain calm in situations that emotionally overwhelm other people. They have spent years navigating tension, unpredictability, conflict, emotional withdrawal, or psychological inconsistency. Chaos became familiar long before they understood what it was doing to them internally. Now, this adaptation comes with both gifts and wounds. Because when a human being becomes accustomed to emotional instability, they often develop extraordinary perception and endurance. But they may also normalize suffering. They may unconsciously seek emotionally intense relationships because peace feels unfamiliar to the nervous system. In trauma psychology, we understand that people are often drawn not toward what is healthy, but toward what is familiar. And this creates one of the central paradoxes in the Heyoka experience. The very environments that wounded them also trained them. The pain sharpened their awareness. The instability forced psychological depth. The rejection strengthened self-reliance. What could have destroyed them became, over time, the source of their emotional intelligence. But this transformation does not happen automatically. Some people go through suffering and become bitter. Others become numb. Others spend their entire lives recreating the original wound because the psyche is trying unconsciously to resolve what was never healed. The mature Heyoka evolves differently. At some point, they stop identifying with the chaos and begin learning from it. That is a profound psychological shift. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" they begin asking, "What has this experience taught me about human nature, about fear, about attachment, about myself?" And the moment suffering becomes conscious, it begins transforming into wisdom rather than trauma repetition. This is why many Heyokas become deeply reflective people. They are not shallow observers of life because they have been forced into confrontation with emotional reality early on. They understand uncertainty. They understand abandonment. They understand contradiction. And because of this, they often develop a rare capacity for empathy, not the performative empathy we see socially, but genuine emotional understanding rooted in lived experience. They know what it feels like to be emotionally unseen. They know the loneliness of carrying pain silently while appearing functional on the outside. And this creates compassion but also discernment. Now, there is another important dimension here. Chaos teaches adaptability. The Heyoka often becomes psychologically flexible because rigid identities cannot survive unstable environments. They learn how to read situations quickly, how to adjust, how to emotionally recalibrate under pressure. While others collapse when certainty disappears, the Heyoka has already learned that certainty was never guaranteed to begin with. And yet the danger is that they can become addicted to survival mode. Many Heyokas struggle to rest. They struggle to trust peace. Their nervous system may associate calmness with vulnerability because historically, calm was often followed by disruption. So even when life becomes stable, internally they may remain hyper-alert, waiting for the next emotional shift. Healing then becomes the process of teaching the body that safety is no longer temporary. And this is where true power emerges, not in surviving chaos, but in no longer needing chaos to feel alive. The mature Heyoka eventually understands that suffering itself is not sacred. Awareness is sacred. Consciousness is sacred. The lesson was never the pain. The lesson was what the pain revealed. Because a person who can walk through emotional darkness without becoming consumed by it develops something very rare in this world: psychological depth without cynicism. And that kind of strength cannot be performed. It can only be earned through the courage to transform suffering into understanding. Another sign often associated with the Heyoka Empath is their unusual effect on toxic power dynamics. And this is something many Heyokas notice long before they understand it consciously. They find themselves repeatedly triggering strong reactions in controlling personalities without intentionally provoking anyone. Narcissistic individuals, emotionally manipulative people, or highly insecure personalities often become unsettled in their presence. And the Heyoka is left confused, wondering, why do people react to me this way when I've done nothing wrong? But psychologically, something very significant is happening beneath the surface. Most unhealthy power structures depend on unconscious participation. Control only works when people automatically accept the emotional rules being imposed on them. Manipulation requires predictability, guilt requires compliance, intimidation requires fear. But the Heyoka often disrupts these dynamics instinctively because they respond to emotional truth more than social conditioning. This does not mean they are rebellious in some dramatic or aggressive sense. In fact, many Heyokas are quiet people. But there is something psychologically difficult to dominate about a person who sees the hidden emotional transaction underneath behavior. For example, when a manipulative person uses guilt to control others, most people respond to the surface emotion. They feel responsible. They defend themselves. They over-explain, but the Heyoka often senses the deeper motive immediately. They recognize that the guilt is not about connection, it is about control. And because they sense this instinctively, they may refuse to engage in the expected emotional script. This is why controlling individuals often describe emotionally perceptive people as difficult, cold, defiant, or disrespectful. What they are actually experiencing is the collapse of unconscious control. And here we must understand something important about human psychology. People who rely on manipulation are often deeply disconnected from themselves. Their identity is built around managing perception, avoiding vulnerability, or maintaining superiority because internally they are fragile. The false self requires constant reinforcement. It needs admiration, obedience, emotional dependence. The Heyoka disrupts this not through confrontation but through authenticity, because authentic presence has a strange effect on performative behavior. It exposes it without words, and this creates tension. Many Heyokas become the target of projection because emotionally immature people feel psychologically exposed around them. They may accuse the Heyoka of being arrogant, overly sensitive, selfish, or emotionally detached. But often these accusations reveal more about the accuser than the person being accused. Carl Jung spoke about projection as the process through which people disown parts of themselves and unconsciously place them onto others. The Heyoka becomes a mirror for this process. People begin reacting not to who the Heyoka truly is, but to what the Heyoka unconsciously reflects back to them. And this can become exhausting. Many Heyokas spend years trying to make themselves smaller, softer, less threatening. They over-explain their intentions. They suppress their intuition. They tolerate unhealthy relationships just to avoid conflict. But eventually something shifts. They begin realizing that their role is not to maintain dysfunctional emotional systems. This is a critical stage of psychological development, because many empaths confuse compassion with self-abandonment. They believe understanding someone's pain means tolerating harmful behavior, but maturity teaches something deeper. Understanding another person's wounds does not require sacrificing your own emotional integrity. The Heyoka begins learning boundaries. Not punishment, not cruelty, boundaries. And healthy boundaries are profoundly disruptive to toxic personalities because they remove access to emotional control. A manipulative person cannot dominate someone who no longer needs their approval. A narcissistic person loses power when admiration is replaced with clarity. Emotional games stop working when the other person refuses unconscious participation. Now, this does not mean the Heyoka becomes emotionally closed. Quite the opposite. Mature discernment actually allows deeper compassion because the person is no longer drowning in emotional confusion. They can care without rescuing. They can love without submitting. They can see pain without becoming consumed by it. And perhaps this is the deeper purpose behind the Heyoka's disruptive nature, not destruction but revelation. Their presence forces hidden dynamics into the light. It challenges illusion. It interrupts emotional dishonesty. Not because they are trying to control others, but because truth itself naturally destabilizes falsehood. But this path can feel lonely because society often rewards performance over authenticity. People are conditioned to maintain appearances, avoid discomfort, protect fragile egos. The Heyoka unconsciously challenges that entire structure simply by being psychologically real. And in the end, their greatest act of rebellion is not fighting toxic people. It is refusing to become toxic in response to them. One of the deepest experiences many Heyoka empaths carry is a profound sense of isolation. And I do not mean simple loneliness in the ordinary sense. I mean the feeling of moving through life psychologically out of sync with the environment around you. Many Heyokas describe feeling different from a very young age, as though they could perceive emotional realities that other people either ignored or denied completely. As children, they often become highly observant. They notice tension behind smiles. They sense emotional instability inside the home even when nobody speaks about it openly. They become aware of contradiction very early, and this creates an internal separation from the collective performance that most social systems depend upon. Now, this can become incredibly confusing for a developing mind, because children naturally want belonging. Human beings are relational creatures. We are wired for attachment, connection, emotional safety, but when a child repeatedly perceives emotional truths that the surrounding environment refuses to acknowledge, they begin questioning themselves. They learn that authenticity may threaten connection, so they adapt. Some become quiet, some become hyper-independent, some become caretakers, some develop humor, intelligence, or emotional attunement as survival strategies. But beneath all of these adaptations is often the same unspoken experience: I do not fully belong here. And over time, this creates isolation, not only from others, but sometimes from the self. Because when people spend years suppressing their perception in order to maintain attachment, they begin disconnecting from their own inner reality. They stop trusting what they feel. They minimize their intuition. They become externally functional while internally fragmented. This is why many Heyokas eventually go through periods of deep withdrawal from the world. Sometimes this happens after betrayal. Sometimes after emotional burnout. Sometimes after years of feeling misunderstood in relationships or social environments. But psychologically, this withdrawal often serves a very important function. It becomes the beginning of self-reconnection. In modern society, solitude is often interpreted as failure. If someone spends too much time alone, people assume something is wrong. But throughout history, periods of isolation have frequently been part of profound psychological transformation. Not because isolation itself is healing, but because silence removes distraction. It forces confrontation with the self. And for the Heyoka, this confrontation is rarely superficial. When external validation disappears, they are forced to ask difficult questions. Who am I beneath adaptation? Beneath trauma responses? Beneath the roles I learned to survive? Am I living authentically or merely performing versions of myself that others found acceptable? These are painful questions because the answers often require grieving relationships, grieving false identities, grieving the years spent abandoning oneself for belonging. But this grief is also liberating, because many Heyokas eventually discover that their isolation was not evidence of brokenness. It was evidence of misalignment. They were trying to force themselves into environments that required emotional dishonesty in order to function, and the nervous system, despite all its suffering, kept resisting that dishonesty. This is where solitude becomes transformative rather than destructive. The Heyoka begins developing a relationship with themselves that is no longer dependent on constant external approval. They learn how to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. They learn how to observe their thoughts, their emotional patterns, their attachment wounds, and slowly self-awareness replaces self-rejection. Now, this does not mean they stop needing human connection. That is another misunderstanding. Healing is not emotional isolation. Human beings still require love, intimacy, belonging. But the mature Heyoka no longer seeks connection at the cost of self-betrayal. That changes everything. Because once a person learns how to be alone without abandoning themselves, they become far less vulnerable to manipulation. They stop clinging to relationships rooted in fear of rejection. They stop tolerating emotional starvation just to avoid loneliness. Solitude teaches discernment. And perhaps most importantly, isolation teaches the Heyoka how to hear their own inner voice beneath the noise of collective expectation. In a culture obsessed with performance, distraction, and social approval, that is a radical act. To know yourself deeply, to trust your perception, to remain authentic even when authenticity costs you acceptance. That is not weakness. That is psychological freedom. Perhaps the most powerful trait associated with the Heyoka empath is not sensitivity itself, but the ability to transform pain into consciousness. This is what separates emotional depth from emotional wisdom. Many people suffer. Many people experience betrayal, rejection, abandonment, humiliation, grief, but not everyone is able to metabolize those experiences in a way that produces insight rather than destruction. The Heyoka, when emotionally mature, develops a kind of psychological alchemy. They learn how to take experiences that could have hardened them and instead allow those experiences to deepen their understanding of themselves and others. Now, this does not happen automatically. Pain alone does not make people wiser. In fact, unresolved pain often does the opposite. It creates defensiveness, bitterness, addiction, emotional numbness, or cycles of unconscious behavior. Trauma that is never examined tends to repeat itself. The nervous system keeps recreating familiar emotional realities because what is familiar feels psychologically safe, even when it is harmful. So the transformation begins the moment suffering becomes conscious. And this requires tremendous courage because most people spend their lives avoiding emotional truth. We distract ourselves. We intellectualize. We blame others. We stay busy. We pursue achievement, status, validation, stimulation, anything to avoid sitting quietly with the deeper wound underneath our behavior. But the Heyoka eventually reaches a point where avoidance no longer works. They begin recognizing patterns. They see how childhood wounds shaped attachment, how abandonment created hyperindependence, how emotional inconsistency created anxiety, how people-pleasing emerged from fear of rejection, and instead of endlessly projecting that pain outward, they begin taking responsibility for understanding it. This is where healing becomes transformative rather than performative. Because real healing is not the construction of a perfect personality, it is the development of awareness, the ability to observe oneself honestly without collapsing into shame. That is an enormous psychological achievement. The mature Heyoka understands that wounds do not disappear simply because we deny them. In fact, what we refuse to face often controls us most powerfully. Anger buried becomes manipulation. Fear buried becomes control. Grief buried becomes emotional disconnection. The unconscious always finds expression. So rather than running from pain, the Heyoka gradually learns how to sit with it consciously, to listen to it, to understand the story beneath it. And something extraordinary begins happening when pain is fully acknowledged without resistance. It starts losing its power to unconsciously dominate behavior. This is why many Heyokas eventually become deeply compassionate people, not because they are naive and not because they excuse harmful behavior, but because suffering has taught them how fragile human beings really are. They understand that behind most destructive behavior is unresolved fear. Behind aggression is often shame. Behind emotional withdrawal is often heartbreak. Again, this does not remove accountability, but it transforms perception. The Heyoka no longer sees people only through the lens of behavior. They begin seeing the wounded nervous systems beneath the behavior, and this creates a different relationship with life itself. Instead of asking, how do I avoid pain forever? They begin asking, how do I remain conscious when pain inevitably arrives? Because suffering is part of human existence. Loss is inevitable. Rejection is inevitable. Mortality is inevitable. The question is not whether life will wound us. The question is whether those wounds will close our hearts or deepen our awareness. This is the essence of emotional alchemy. The Heyoka becomes capable of holding paradox. They can recognize darkness without becoming consumed by cynicism. They can acknowledge betrayal without losing the capacity for love. They can see manipulation clearly without surrendering to hatred. That balance is rare. And perhaps this is why many Heyokas feel both deeply human and strangely detached from the superficiality of modern culture. They have touched emotional depths that make shallow performances feel empty. They understand that true strength is not domination, it is integration. To be emotionally honest without becoming emotionally overwhelmed, to remain compassionate without abandoning discernment, to carry pain without turning it into identity. That is real power. Because in the end, the most dangerous person is not the one who has never suffered. It is the person who has suffered deeply, faced themselves honestly, and emerged with their humanity still intact.